Welcome back to What's New with You. You are watching this episode. We are with Alek Yerbury. Alek Yerbury is the leader of the National Rebirth Party. He's been involved in politics for many years. He was educated in Australia, served in the British forces, and now leads what the media would consider the far right, but most of us would consider common sense politics when it comes to nationalism. Alek, thank you for joining me today.
No, and thank you very much for for inviting me on your program.
So, if anyone types up your name on Google, the media is going to hammer you as some neo-Nazi, far-right fascist, blah, 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 blah. The typical thing that they like to do. Where actually do you sit ideologically, would you say?
So I would say that I sit very much in a genuine third position. That is not the right in the sense of not conservatism and capitalism, and not the left in the sense of internationalism and communism and Marxism. I think I sit in a genuinely third position where we do advocate, or I advocate for a kind of socialism and a collectivized society, but not to the extreme of globalism and internationalism, and not to the extreme where people are given rights but no responsibilities at the same time. I very much think that people must be given duties and responsibilities to society for every right that they are given.
Yeah, no, I'd completely agree. Now, I think when people hear the word socialism, they automatically start thinking about like food stamps and people starving and blah blah blah. But the actual aspect of like a socialized society is more we have more national control over these industries, which benefit the entire population. For example, like energy and water and stuff like that. I think in the market that we currently have, people don't realize that a lot of these industries are dominated by multinational business, which does not benefit the actual people of this nation. And that's the difference between patriotism and nationalism. Nationalism seeks to benefit us more as an actual collective. Would you say that's fair?
Yes, I would completely. And when you talk about what people's connotations are when they hear the word socialism, it's a really good point to bring out, because you see a lot of people now that will associate socialism with the militant left and the radical left and even communism. But the reality is that socialism is the reason why we have a public health service. Socialism is the reason why we have public education. Socialism is the reason why people have pensions. It's the reason why people had the franchise to vote in the first place, even if they didn't own land. These things are actually what socialism is. And what we've seen over the last 50 to 60 years is socialism has become twisted from what it actually should be into international socialism and international Marxism. And so what you've effectively seen is socialism be corrupted in the same way that many entities that you would sort of associate with socialism, like trade unions, have now just become corrupted institutions that create an industry and run an industry in their own right. And you are quite right in what you say when you bring out the difference between patriotism and nationalism, and the sense that often when people talk about patriotism, what they're actually often talking about is classical liberal conservatism, which is fixated on international capitalism, free markets, individualism, individual liberalism. And that again is a really good point to bring out, because those principles, principles of individualism, international capitalism, and international finance, and the free market, have actually done more than anything else to bring about a lot of society's biggest problems today, such as mass immigration, terrible public services, the terrible state of the economy, mass unemployment or underemployment. These things have actually been caused by a lot of those supposedly patriotic principles.
So I watched one of your speeches earlier that you gave, I think it was 2023, where you were basically saying that it's not the refugees' fault, it's the people that put the system for them to use in the first place. And I think a lot of people, especially the people that I would say are quite politically illiterate, will just go, well, it's the refugees, they're the reason everything's bad, they're coming over on boats, blah, 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 blah. I mean, you can blame people for using the system, But do you not think that people just completely ignore the system that is being put in place by the politicians, by the lobbyists, by the multinationals for their benefit economically at the expense of the livelihoods of the British people?
So I think there's probably 2 points that I would use to answer that question. And I think you are correct. But there's 2 points that I would bring out to answer that or to respond to that. Firstly, is I think the reason why people will often attack the symptom rather than attack the problem is because if they identify mentally that the problem is insurmountable, that the root problem is to change the entire economic, social, and political system, if they believe mentally that that task is insurmountable, then all they really have left is to attack the symptom and try and treat the symptom. And that is wrong because the problem is actually resolvable and it is not insurmountable. It just requires an incredible amount of work and an incredible amount of thought. But the second part is that I think that the powers that be now actually encourage people to attack the symptom. They encourage people to look at the problem in a very simplistic way. To take the current situation with the protests at the migrant hotels, which flare up, every year that flares up, and it's been doing for 2 or 3 years. Now that is attacking a symptom, but from the perspective of people like Keir Starmer, it is actually better for him if people are expending all that time and energy going and besieging a migrant hotel and attacking a migrant hotel, because if they are spending all their time and energy attacking that target, it's like spending all their time and energy attacking a pawn on the chessboard whilst ignoring the fact that in order to win the game, you don't have to actually take the pawns. What you have to actually do is capture the king. And this is, I think, very much deliberate. As much as they will often go on television and denounce people for protesting against immigrants or denounce people for attacking the symptoms, deep down and behind closed doors, they will be sat there congratulating each other on the fact that their enemies aren't attacking them. They're just attacking the cannon fodder that they've thrown at.
Yeah, and I think when people read behind the surface, if you look at the media has its own ideals of why it puts out reports. When it's putting out reports saying these far right thugs protesting at these hotels, blah 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 blah, it's used to try and anger the British people. Because if it angers the British people, then they'll go out more and do it in defiance of what the media is saying. But the more that you're doing it, the more that you're blaming these people and you're willingly allowing yourself to be labelled far right out of protest, you are then simply ignoring the fact that's what they want you to do. And the more they want you to do that, the more they're going to keep you down, the more they're going to continue with mass immigration. I mean, we've seen it through every single government. They continue mass immigration no matter what. I mean, it was the Tories that were promising net migration down to tens of thousands. And then we saw a massive spike with hundreds of thousands of migrants. They are just corrupt to the very core. And do you think this is going to backfire on the government and start a civil war? Or do you think they want it to start a civil war?
I think that realistically, let's hypothetically imagine that a civil war were to start tomorrow. The reality is that there isn't really any sort of challenging faction that would have any capability of winning that at this point in time anyway. So in some respects, the powers that be don't necessarily care if it does or not, because at the end of the day, whilst there are understandably tens of millions of people that absolutely hate what the government is doing, what you haven't got is an organized opposition that actually has those tens of millions of people in its ranks, but also has a clear plan for what it was going to do instead of that system. Now, this is kind of the fundamental problem, because the average person is never going to burn the house down until they actually know where they're going to live instead. The average person is never going to demolish the status quo until they already know what they're going to replace it with. And a lot of the trap, the whether you call it the radical right, the dissident right, the far right, what a lot of the trap that it falls into is it effectively shifts away from nationalism and more towards just anarchism, where it's about destroying the system and bringing down the system. But most of the time, 99% of the time, there's no coherent idea of what they actually want to replace that system. It's just very vague ideas like, well, remigrate 5 million people, or, oh, well, just nationalize everything. and there's no real ideological vision behind that. It's just a series of things that people want to be done, and slogans, and it's empty. And this is ultimately why, when we created the NRP, we realized that you actually have to have that agenda and that vision already in place from the second you begin. You can't just work on the basis of opposition and then try and work out what you would actually do with power later down the road. You can't do it. And that is the trap that the overwhelming majority of anti-establishment factions at the moment fall into.
So, what would you say is the NRP's main goals moving forwards at this point in time? Then, considering you have a plan of what you actually want to achieve, how are we moving forwards with that?
So I think to get to the point where a party can come into existence and create a political agenda, to then get to the point where it can actually look at forming a government, that is a process which could take 10, 15 years to do. It's not something that you can cheat. It's not something that you can simply click your fingers and materialize into existence, because you cannot you cannot gerrymander your way into power. You cannot trick people into putting you in power. You have to genuinely convince tens of millions of people to give that power to you, because that is the only way that you're going to get it in the first place and be able to keep it for long enough to actually do anything constructive with it. And I know some people will say, well, that's impossible. It's impossible to break the two-party system. But if you look back historically, we can actually look at an example of a party in the last 100 years that has actually broken the two-party system in Britain, which was the Labour Party, which went from non-existence in the early 20th century to a party of government in 1945. And so when people say, well, you can't break the two-party system, actually you can. But the only way you can is by offering a genuine ideological alternative. In the case of Labour, it was socialism compared to the Conservatives and the Liberals. You have to offer something which is genuinely alternative enough in its vision that it is actually worth people supporting instead of what is already there. And so, what are we doing? Every action we take, whether it's the street stalls, whether it's the canvassing, whether it's the establishing of branches, whether it's people carrying out work in their own area, such as establishing neighbourhood watches, working with charity schemes, even things that are done in conjunction with other political organisations. Everything that we are doing is centered around creating, one, a sense of legitimacy, that the NRP is actually a legitimate political party. It's not a political party just by technical virtue of the fact that it's registered as one. It's a political party by virtue of the fact that it actually has a genuine and complete political vision. But also, it's about proving that the things that we are promoting are actually capable of achieving good things, which is where doing constructive things actually comes into play. And it can't just be about protesting against things, because that's not what political parties exist for. They're not there to protest against things. They're there to actually provide solutions, not to just come as a supplicant demanding someone else do it for them.
And do you think, like, so we've got the whole votes at 16 now, but we're also seeing that the new generations are a lot more conservative and reactionary to a lot of the social issues. They've given up the whole idea about being gay and woke and all of that, and now they want to move more into real nationalism more. Do you think that's going to benefit you guys more than the establishment and the media is willing to admit?
I think that it can, in the sense of, you've got a lot of people now that they don't want to live in a society without rules anymore and without discipline. They don't want to live in a world where everybody can just act as a complete individual and do whatever they want, even to the detriment of people around them. So there is a sense of collective identity coming back, which is absolutely a powerful force, and that is absolutely a good and useful thing. Where I think the challenge is going to be is to ensure that shall we say, social conservatism, or that sort of, I think when people maybe look back and think, well, 100 years ago we had that sense of collective identity. I think the challenge is ensuring that it does not just get rooted in a totally reactionary mindset, where people simply want to wind the clock back by X many years, because the reality is, if you wound the clock back politically now to, say, 1950, inevitably 30 years, 40 years later, the exact same problems are then going to surface again, because the situation that we're in now is not something that just happened in the last 5 to 10 years. A lot of what you're seeing now is actually the culmination of problems that took root maybe 100 years ago, but have taken that long to actually materialize into serious consequences. For example, when people introduced the idea of human rights and asylum at the end of the Second World War, they never would have done that if they had believed that 70 years later it would lead to thousands upon thousands of people swimming or coming across the English Channel in order to abuse the benefit system. They never would have agreed to the concept of human rights if they believed that it would lead to murderers, rapists, paedophiles, thieves avoiding punishment for crimes. And so, this is where the challenge is to take that desire for a more collective identity, and to actually stop it from simply regressing into a backwards, solely conservative mentality.
Yeah, so I think there needs to be some form of like sensibility about these things. I mean, a lot of the people nowadays, especially the young people, they want to protect heritage, they want to protect culture. And I mean, the government put out its points on what can be considered extreme right terrorist ideologies, and one of those was the fact that you think that foreign cultures are immoral or worse than your culture. That is now a terrorist ideology. I think that's a bit crazy. I think our culture's better. I mean, I'm in slack because I said that Pakistani culture and shagging your cousin's a bit weird, but it's just my opinion. But I think that we're moving into a weird time where the youth are beginning to I would say wake up. I say that very lightly with the idea of protecting heritage. We've moved away from acceptance of everything. We just think that's crap. Do you think maybe it's time the UK stops being so liberal and democratic with things and has more of an authority over it to get shit done, basically?
Yeah, I do. I think that what you've got in terms of the political system of today, what you've effectively ended up with is a form of just oligarchy, where it's very much run like a club where you're either in it or you're not. And one of the biggest problems with the current system, and it is the party political system as it stands now, is that it's people are very much removed from a sense of responsibility. You have people that occupy positions of public office that have effectively been insulated from any personal consequence for the decisions they make. If you are, for example, a prime minister and you run the country into the ground, the worst thing that will happen to you is that you get pensioned off and enjoy hundreds of thousands of pounds a year for the rest of your life. It's not real. It's not a consequence. You simply walk off and leave it in ruins. And this concept, I think, is prevalent throughout the entire system now, where there's no real there's no real I would say accountability. There is accountability, but accountability without any kind of consequences isn't really accountability at all, because as much as you can say, oh, well, that person is to blame, if there's no consequence for any mistake, then you may as well not waste your time holding them to account for it. And I think that people will confuse the ability to vote with the ability to actually get a legitimate government. And what I mean by this, and there was a phrase I heard many years ago that I think explains this, where they said, I forget who originally said it, but they said, just giving people the ability to choose from a list of options does not actually mean that any of those options are going to be the options that the average person actually wants. The mob choosing and the choice of the mob are two fundamentally different things. And what you've effectively got now is a series of old parties of the system, where they know that in order to actually win power, all they have to do is be slightly less terrible than every other option on the table. And so there's no real care, there's no real incentive or interest in actually listening to people or actually creating a genuinely good future for people. It's simply about, well, if he's terrible, I just have to be a little bit better than terrible, and I won't put in any more effort than that. And it's it's a reflection of a fundamentally broken political system.
Yeah, I mean, so you mentioned the fact that there's no accountability. Do you think we should bring back treasonous laws? If you have put this country on its knees, you should be strung up, maybe not strung up in the street, but you should be put to court for treason against the British people.
Yes, I think you should. I mean, I believe in the death penalty anyway, and it's in our party program to bring it back. But yeah, I absolutely do think that if people are knowingly carrying out actions that cause harm and misery to millions and millions of people, and they have done that simply for their own self-interest, then absolutely they should be punished. It's a crime. It's not just a crime against individual people. It's a crime against your entire nation, race, and society, because you are sabotaging the future of your own people. And I can't really think of a worse crime.
Yeah, so I'd say that one thing, especially that we have in Parliament, is conflict of interest. You have people with dual citizenship, and you have people that follow different religious doctrine to what we were created on. Do you think we should probably ban, number one, ban people that aren't heritagely British from being in Parliament? But do you also think that we should ban certain religious groups from being in our political system?
So when it comes to heritage, I think that we need to fundamentally rework the way that we judge citizenship and belonging. I think that, and this is again part of our party program anyway, is that citizenship and obviously the rights and duties that come with it, including the ability to stand for public office and participate in political government of a country, it has to that citizenship has to be based on some kind of test where you can demonstrate some kind of heritage that links you to this country through multiple generations, hundreds of years. You should have to demonstrate some kind of ethnic heritage that links you to this country to be a citizen. And obviously being a citizen gives you the right to participate in political life of a country. When it comes to religion, uh, I do think, and again, this is part of our party's agenda. I do think that there should not actually be a state-sanctioned religion. I think we need to accept the total separation of religion and the state. Many countries in Europe, already have some for centuries, but I think we need to actually do that in Great Britain. I know that there are religions in Britain which are, fundamentally much more foreign religions, and people will bring up things like Islam, but you could equally apply that to things like Judaism, Buddhism, any sort of foreign religion. But I think that the only way that you can properly address the religious issue is to simply separate religion and the state completely and say, look, you can have freedom of religion as you please, but your religion cannot be teaching things or encouraging things that are incompatible with earthly laws as society and the state is laying them down, because I think that's when you get the issue. And ultimately that was the whole point of the Renaissance and the Reformation. It was this argument of, is the church the supreme authority on earth, or is national law the supreme authority on earth? That was the whole point of the Protestant movement. That was the whole point of nations separating away from religious government to national government. And I think that principle is the only real principle that you can make a state function in, because it comes down to, like you said, the conflict of interest. You can't have people, especially in positions where they're writing laws and in government, where they are allowing religious dogma to determine their idea of right and wrong, as opposed to a realistic assessment of what is in the best interests of the British people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Christian nationalist, so I believe in like Christian government and putting Christian values to the forefront. But I do understand the argument against it, and I do understand the argument of like societal morality over some form of divine morality. I would say, do you think that society can have a stable set of rules if it is godless, or do you think that's just going to lead to some form of conflict because human beings themselves are incapable of having their own moral framework?
I don't think that it would inherently lead to a chaotic society, but at the same time, I think that most Western societies and the concept of legal right and wrong, and this does predate even the Christianization of a lot of parts of Europe, is that the concept of right and wrong as laid down in Christian religion is in 95% of cases identical to the concept of right and wrong as Western Europeans would understand it anyway. So I don't really think that that conflict is likely to emerge in a society where it's predominantly Christian or where the governing or the people governing it have Christian beliefs. I don't think that having a godless society inherently means that you are going to have an immoral society. I mean, after all, there are countries in Eastern Europe, and I'm particularly looking at the Baltic states, where they're some of the most irreligious countries in the world, and yet they have a very stable ethnocentric society. So I don't think it's guaranteed to be that way, but I also don't think that there's any inherent loss to having a religious society. I think that there's absolutely nothing wrong with people having a religious framework. The only time you ever get an issue is when that religious framework conflicts with what the overwhelming majority of people understand to be right and wrong. And you don't really get that with modern interpretations of Christianity. I can understand how those problems arise when you get forces like radical Islam, because often the concept of right and wrong is so different to what Europeans would understand it. But yeah, I think that it's not guaranteed. It doesn't really matter, really. I think.
Yeah. So I mean, Christianity based. But what I would ask is, you mentioned there when talking about the Baltic states, you said ethno states. Now, most people, I don't know how many people that watch this actually know what an ethno state is. That's mainly where like the native population is the dominant factor within a country. We're moving away from that more in the Western world, and it's becoming very bad if you want an ethno state now. We get told we're Nazis for wanting that. But I mean, if you look at like Japan, for example, Japan is an ethno state. There was ethno states before the World Wars. Do you think we should return to being an ethno state?
Yeah, I think you have to. I think you have to build a society on a frame and a country on something which is objective and something which is totally tangible, which cannot change, or if it can change, it's very, very hard to change. And the natural unit to base a nation around is its people, its ethnic group, it's the genetic composition of its people, because that is not something which can very easily or very quickly change, and it is something that does not change in the course of a person's life or existence. It is what it is, and it cannot be changed. You are born with the same ethnic and genetic makeup that you die with. That is it. You cannot modify it in your life. So a state which is founded as an ethnocentric state will inherently be more stable than any other kind of state. It's why, you to point to the examples you've just brought out, it's why countries like Japan have been incredibly stable for thousands and thousands of years. It's why countries in Europe in the past have been very stable. It's why, if you look today at some of these countries in Eastern Europe, it's one of the reasons why they are politically much more stable than many of the countries in Western Europe, because they have a more intuitive and inbuilt understanding of what actually links those people together. And when you talk about creating an ethno state, I don't think it is actually ever possible to create a state in which 100% of the population is ethnically pure. I mean, the only country on earth that you could argue is anything like that is North Korea, but North Korea is pretty terrible to live in for the majority of people. It's like Stalinist Russia. But what I think you need to do is you need to be looking at it from a perspective of political vision and saying, well, look, a country which is the more homogenous a country is, the better the quality of life is going to be for everybody in that country, even if there is a small number of people in that country who are ethnically foreign. Their quality of life as an ethnic minority in a homogenous, stable country will actually be better than their quality of life as a much larger minority in an ethnically balkanized country. And again, you look at a country like Japan, and even if you are an ethnic minority in Japan, you will actually have a much more stable, better quality of life than if you're an ethnic minority in somewhere like Britain now. And so that is, I think, the fundamental fact is that the more homogenous a country is, even if some individuals might be worse off on an individual level because they have to leave or because they can't do all the things they want, the quality of life for everybody in that country, for the collective, will actually be better, and that includes people that aren't actually of that dominant ethnic group. And so therefore all the policy that is coming out and all of the actions taken on immigration, on demographics, you have to be working towards how can I keep my country as homogenous as I practically can without seriously destroying the quality of life, because the more homogenous I can keep it, the better it is going to be and the more stable it is going to be.
Yeah, no, I'd completely agree with that. So, I mean, this is what we're all about the reactionary point of view. You have people that will go, no, it needs to be fully white. Our country needs to be fully white. That's ridiculous. It's not going to happen. I mean, I make the point that we've had people in this country for hundreds of years that are a minority. That's just the way that it is. Do we integrate via race mixing? I mean, I don't believe it's a sin. I wouldn't personally do it, but I mean, that's up to the individual. But then on the other hand, you've got all the neoconservatives, and me and the neoconservatives, we don't get on very well. But the neoconservatives, they sit there and they say, oh, well, Kemi Badenoch, for example, well, she's British. She was born in, I mean, she no longer identifies as Nigerian. I no longer identify as a human being because I was born in nature. I am now a tree, but whatever. So they say that. And I think there is this weird idea that for a specifically white nations, this is where the argument comes in. White nations get hammered. You must be more accepting. You must include minorities. It's fine that we call it the browning of the Western civilization.
Yeah.
That's fine in the media's point of view. But if we were to talk about somewhere like Japan, like if Japan all of a sudden just turned white, we kicked out all the Japanese people or replaced them over a period of time, and it turned white, there would be serious issues. People would call that colonialization and stuff like that. But for it to happen to a white country, I think that's just normalized now. Would you say that white people, white nations, white heritage, white culture is under threat by the modern liberalized world?
Yes, it is. Though what I would say as well is I personally don't like to talk about things in terms of white nationalism. I would much rather talk about things, Europeans or British people, Germans, French, whatever. Now, I understand why the concept of sort of whiteness, I understand why that has become so prominent in the West now. And a lot of it, I think, has been influenced by political development in America, because obviously is America is, even when it was a predominantly or an overwhelmingly white country, it was still a multicultural country in the sense that you had British, French, Germans, etc., etc., Spanish. So it's never been a homogenous country. But obviously, now that you've started to get large populations of blacks and large populations of Mexicans, what you've now got is people are sort of less identifying as, well, I'm a French American, I'm a British. You don't hear this anymore. Maybe 150 years ago, some people would have called themselves German Americans, French Americans, English Americans. Now they'll just say they're white Americans, because that's effectively been that white population has effectively been, shall we say, homogenized into its own block and its own identity. I think in Europe it's obviously very different, because even in countries in Europe that have high levels of immigration and high levels of foreign racial influence, people still very much do have their own ethnic identities. You know, a Frenchman is not a German is not an Englishman is not a Pole is not a Russian, you know, etc., etc. So I think to try and transpose the American idea of whiteness onto Europe, it doesn't really work. Um, but absolutely, if you were to talk about it as a collective of white people as a whole, absolutely are under threat in a way that other people aren't, racially and demographically. But the point has to be made that the overwhelming majority of the forces that are trying to cause this damage are actually treacherous white European people that are doing this simply for personal gain. They don't care how damaged, you know, their own ethnic group and their own race and nation become, as long as they personally are okay. And you know, to look at Britain today as an example, people like Keir Starmer, he doesn't care about problems like demographic replacement because it's never going to affect him, because he has enough money to go and live in a totally white British homogenous area with high living standards and personal security where he doesn't have to deal with that problem. Now, people living, you know, white British people living in a place like Birmingham, they do have to deal with the problem. You know, and even when you go to places like Birmingham, it's so bad now that even the majority of immigrants will complain about immigration in a place that is supposedly not even majority white British anymore. So yeah, I think that white British people, or white people in general, absolutely are under more of a threat, but it's because the economic and political and social systems that white European countries are maintaining are actually the biggest contributor to that threat.
Yeah, so I mean, like, I know your best friends at Hope Not Hate, that love you very much, with the amount of articles they shove out about you. They would claim that this conversation is white supremacy and blah 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 blah. It's not. It's sensibility. We're not saying that one race is superior. We're saying that it's good to preserve the heritage of your people, and I think that's just a completely normal and acceptable thing. Now, I would say people like to pretend there are no cultural issues. There's no cultural tensions in the UK. I mean, as you said, Birmingham. I went to Birmingham a few weeks ago. It's a shithole, and I say that nicely, but it's been completely, absolutely annihilated from the inside, because we have enclaves of people that come over. They have different cultural values. They have different societal values, and they don't integrate with these things. What do we do about these communities in Birmingham, in Manchester, in London that aren't integrating, are basically segregating themselves and setting up their own form of mini little country within the state?
So I think it cannot be ignored why these communities and these enclaves have come into existence. Now, it is true that the foreign policies of countries like Britain over the last 50 years have actually gone a long way to cause many of these people to come here in the first place. I mean, to look at what's happened in the last 10 or 20 years, the reason why there's a massive influx of Afghanis, the reason why there's a massive influx of Syrians, the reason why there's a massive influx of Libyans, Somalians, a lot of this is because of the foreign policies that European countries have actually exported, have not only put a lot of these countries in ruin, or at least have contributed to the problems that have put them in ruin, but then have also simultaneously opened the doors to absolutely anybody to come here as a way to get away from that ruin. Now, to me, you know, the obvious answer was they should never have put those places in ruin in the first place. But, you know, obviously you're saying, well, now they're here. What do we actually do about it? I think the reality is that the majority of these people, they would actually go back to the place where they genuinely belong, or even if they didn't want to personally go, they wouldn't necessarily stop you sending them there, provided that the place that you were sending them to was not in such absolute destitution that you'd honestly rather fight like hell to stay here than actually be put on a plane or a boat and sent back there. You know, and so I mean, so when people talk about foreign aid money, and you know we spend money on, and I think it is ridiculous that we spend money on countries like India. It is ridiculous because they've got so much money, they just mismanage how they use it. But the reality is that you could probably do more to actually move these people back to, their rightful place of origin by simply creating some kind of workable environment for them to actually go back to, and to stop doing the things that are actually making those environments and those places like Syria, Libya, etc., completely unlivable for the people that are there, whilst simultaneously offering asylum and opening the floodgates to anybody that wants it. I think that it takes a lot to actually to leave your own country and your own homeland and a place where you have this intuitive connection, to leave that and to go somewhere else is not something that people are mentally going to do lightly. And the kinds of people that do it are only ever going to be doing it because they're just following where some kind of temporary prosperity is. If they couldn't get it in Germany, they'd go to France. If they couldn't get it in France, they'd go to Britain. And so there isn't really any, I don't believe there isn't really any deeply ingrained desire that those people have to want to live here. They are simply here for pragmatic reasons. And as soon as there is somewhere better for them to go, or as soon as it becomes more untenable for them to be here, whether that's because the welfare system is cracked down on and isn't allowed to be abused anymore, or certain things that are able to be exploited are not able to be exploited anymore, the overwhelming majority of those people will either go back to the places that they came from originally, or will simply look for somewhere else that they can temporarily sponge off, if that is what their goal is. And so I think you can actually address the overwhelming majority of these enclaves and these unintegrated communities simply by removing the carrots that are causing them to remain here, and stop contributing to the problems that are causing them to come here in the first place.
Yeah, so I got two things to say for that. So you go on about the fact a lot of these countries have been basically bombed to the ground. That's what's happened. A lot of that from the war on terror as well, which I say is more an American issue in the reason that we actually got involved in these things. Do you think maybe we should move away from our special relationship with America if it's harming us domestically?
Yeah, I absolutely do, and again, this is something that is reflected in our party's agenda. We don't have a specific policy towards specific countries, but the overarching point of our attitude towards foreign policy is that you cannot treat countries in the same way that you treat people. They're not your friends, they're not your enemies. They are just entities with their own interests based upon what their own people and governments want. That is how you have to treat them. You have to approach foreign policy in a much more mercantile way, and you have to be able to say, it is not in our interest to continue these treaties or this relationship with you at this point in time, so we aren't going to do it anymore. Now, in order to be able to have a more independent foreign policy like that, you need to simultaneously work to make yourself more economically and militarily independent, which is again why we have other provisions in our agenda regarding things like remilitarizing our own country so that we're not dependent on organizations like NATO or countries like the USA, reorganizing our economy so that we aren't dependent on free trade relationships with the EU or with the USA to function. You have to be able to pursue a genuinely independent foreign policy based upon your own people's national interest.
Yeah. And the second question I had to ask is, does the National Rebirth Party support remigration for those people that don't want to go back?
I think whether or not somebody is permitted to exist in a country is not actually down for them to say as an individual. I think it's down to what is in the best interests of the country as a whole and everybody around them. So, I totally accept that there are people who they might want to be here, but just because they want to be here, it doesn't actually mean that they are entitled to be here. And the reality is that if an individual, and for someone who is not an immigrant, for somebody who is a white British person who is a detriment to the society and people around them, the place that they belong is in prison. Now, if you are an immigrant and you are a detriment to society and the people around you, the place that you belong is somewhere very, very far away from here. That is the bottom line of it. Is a society should not tolerate the existence of people in it who are willfully detrimental to it. It shouldn't tolerate it.
Yeah, and I would say that, especially with like people go on about international law is so cringe in certain aspects, because if the international law is hurting us and it's making our actual domestic society worse for the people that are here, should we just ignore it, or should we actually listen to it and be diplomatic and blah blah blah?
And you've always got to be diplomatic with people to some degree, but the reality of international law, and it's a bit like things like the UN are exactly the same, is it is effectively propped up by people's desire to simply follow it of their own volition. And countries that are sufficiently independent or sufficiently powerful effectively can do whatever they want anyway, because there's not really any ability to challenge it. It's like if you can imagine, people get charged with crimes, and look at it nationally. People get charged with offences and told to go to court. They don't turn up to court simply because they feel like they have an obligation to report to the court to be tried and then potentially punished. They turn up because if they don't, the police will go and find them and drag them there and force them to be there, whether they like it or not. The underlying point I'm making there being that the way of the world and the way of nature is that might does make right anyway, whether you wish to believe it or not. And states which are sufficiently powerful can effectively do whatever they please, regardless of international law. And so I think that, yes, whilst these international laws might exist, the reality is that if you as a state are able to make yourself sufficiently independent and sufficiently powerful in your own right, you can effectively take unilateral action regardless of what anybody says about it. And this is what countries like Russia, the United States, China, they do. That's what they do all the time.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So we've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to do some more rapid fire questions about certain things. So the current political scale, everybody used to say reform, far right, blah, 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 blah. Reform, do we think they've gone far too soft? Do we think they're adopting more left-leaning policies?
I think Reform is still actually a far right party in the sense that it is a hyper capitalistic party. I think it's very much like Thatcherite conservatism on steroids. That's how I describe it to people. But socially, it has become very liberalised.
Yeah, no, I'd completely agree. Do you think that you said Thatcherise? So Thatcher sold off a lot of our industry. Do you think that Britain needs its domestic industry to be a powerhouse again?
Yes, I do, because it is the only way that you can actually fully realise a genuinely independent national community is to give yourself a degree of economic strength and some ability to self-sustain. Yeah, I totally understand that it isn't actually possible to create a totally self-sufficient state again, unless you want to live like North Korea, which nobody does. But it is entirely possible to create a state which has much more autonomy in the way it acts in the world by virtue of the fact that it has a much greater degree of self-sufficiency, self-production. And so, yeah, I think that is one reason. Another reason why we need to be looking to rebuild our own industrial capabilities is because it offers enormous opportunities for employment and productivity for our own people. There are huge parts of the country, we're thinking places like South Wales, the Northeast, Glasgow, areas around the Black Country. There are huge parts of the country where millions of people are stuck in either generations of unemployment or generations of underemployment, simply because the industries that enabled those towns and cities and urban conurbations to exist aren't there anymore. And so reinvigorating those industries gives people those opportunities.
Yeah, no, I agree. So on your party policies, one of them is mandatory military service. Now, a lot of people, especially the generation that we're currently living in, don't want to do that. They say, no, I don't want to serve for this country. What would you say to those people to convince them that actually military service is beneficial?
So, firstly, I think a lot of people, when they read that, they think, well, you're proposing that we implement that right now with the government we have right now. But obviously, that's not the case because you're devising that agenda with the idea that you will be the faction and the government that is implementing it, along with everything else on that agenda. But ultimately, being part of a national community and being part of a society has to come with certain responsibilities and certain duties. You cannot just give people rights on their own. People also have to have duties. And one of those duties has to be that you are willing to do something to contribute to the defence and protection of that national community.
No, I completely agree. Do you think that maybe we do need to implement this sooner rather than later? Do you think we're heading towards more of a global conflict? I mean, we've seen you got the Israel-Palestine that keeps flaring up with the Middle East beginning to get a little bit more bomby. Russia-Ukraine still dragging on now with the threats of nukes, with America moving over its submarines. Do you think maybe now is the time that we start putting people into the military?
I encourage all young men. I encourage all young men that you should spend, a year or two in the military. You should, even if you join the reserves, do something simply because the mentality and the skills and the idea of collectivism in practice, because that's what a military environment is. It will that I think the mindset you get from that will enable you to be much more effective in life and society, no matter what you do. But in terms of what is coming up, I don't think we are looking at a global war scenario. Now, you would know if that was going to happen because, for example, when people have said, "Well, Keir Starmer's going to bring back conscription, and then we'll have World War III." Well, having been in it and thinking about all of the steps that would be involved in actually doing that, and the fact that if you wanted to actually conscript millions of people, you've got to build the infrastructure, you've got to build the war munitions factories, you've got to train all of the officers and NCOs that are going to train millions of people. It would take you about 5 years to do all that anyway. So the warning signs would be there long before it actually started. It wouldn't just happen like that. But the other thing is, I think the global crisis that is coming up is going to be much more comparable to the Great Depression than a world war, where it will be more economic collapse. And I don't mean economic collapse in some apocalyptic way. It's not going to be some doomsday scenario. It will just be economic collapse in the sense of the cost of living will become very high. Many people, millions more people will be out of work. Lots of people will find themselves unable to pay rents. It will be an economic catastrophe comparable to the Great Depression, where it won't destroy the very existence of states, but it will seriously degrade the quality of life of people. And it will, at the same time as that is happening, a lot of the last remnants of faith that people have in the current system will begin to disappear.
No, I completely agree. Last question I got for you. One of your favourite parties, the Homeland Party. They're currently having major issues with their leader, Kenny Smith. What are your opinions on Kenny Smith, and what are the opinions on the way that the Homeland Party is going? Do you think it's going to fail?
Look, to summarise my take on it, I don't think that party is salvageable, and the reason it is not salvageable is because, as much as I can absolutely believe that the majority of the people in it want rid of the current leaders, the bottom line is, from what I've seen of it, there isn't anybody in the dissenting majority that are actually offering anything better themselves. And so that to me is, you've then got a situation where the majority of people don't want the current status quo, but they also have no ability to create anything else either. So I think it's untenable.
No, I completely agree. If you want, you can give a little closing statement, just sum up who you are, where they can find you, and that kind of thing.
Okay. Well, look. Thank you very much for having me on the program. It's been a great hour, and it's been some really good topics of conversation. If you want to look up the party, you can find it online, nationalrebirthparty.org.uk. You can also find us on X, on Facebook, on Telegram. You're welcome to contact the party. You're welcome to contact me. We have our first national meeting and conference on the 6th of September. We still have a small number of tickets left, and that's in West Yorkshire. So if anybody is interested, by all means, get in touch. But all those things aside, it's been a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alec. Well, maybe I'll have to pop down to the conference in September. I'll see what I'm doing. But guys, thank you for watching. This has been Hugh talking to Alek Yerbury. Maybe now the media can say what it likes, but in all fairness, you can hear the raw opinions, the true opinions. We're not extreme people. We're just people that care deeply about this country, and that's how we should be. We need a system that does look after the British people, ignoring the slogans that get thrown at us, ignoring the civil war on a verbal sense that they try and put us into. We need logical conversation. We need strong national policy for the benefit of Britain so that we can move forwards to a future of hope, not one of poverty and despair.